This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I'm your host today, Russ Hugo. I'm sitting in for the Lord of Productivity, Tony Black. With me today is Caredwen Foley. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's great to finally chat with you, and today we're going to be talking about Pine Bluff Variant. So this was Season 5, Episode 18, aired May 3rd, 1998. Directed by Rob Bowman, and it shows written by John Shaban. It seems like Carter had a lot of influence on this episode, though. IMDb gave this 8.3, kind of right about in the middle of the season. What rating would you give this episode, and what are your overall thoughts?
So it's interesting that that rating, although I think IMDb users land on it in kind of a perhaps not strictly particularly reliable, maybe statistically kind of way. I think the range of responses tends to be pretty condensed on some of those ratings. I would say probably 8.5 sounds about right to me. I am very, very fond of this episode. I think the kind of cinematic nature of it really shows, and I have a real soft spot for these sort of conspiracy episodes more than the kind of science fiction episodes. I think that pursuing this sort of thread of paranoia and doubt about the nature of the threat and the quest that Mulder has been on, it makes a lot of sense to kind of feed that into these sort of militia paranoia sentiments, and it makes a lot of sense that members of a group like that might approach him and try to kind of use him for their own ends. So, I think this episode really captures something kind of particular to the 1990s that I find interesting, and I also I find the subject matter of the pursuit of a bioweapon and the continuation of the biotesting kind of intriguing as well. So, I'm quite fond of this one. How about you?
I find there's a lot to really love about it, and I will echo a lot of what you say. It's one of those ones where I really have to give the direction and the pacing of the script. There are a few issues with the script. I'd probably give this, I'm a little bit grouchier, I think. I like to have a full curve on my rating. So I'd probably give this maybe like a 7.5. Pacing and the energy is fabulous. And one of the best, if we rated it in that instance with like direction and energy, it's definitely in the top 10, I would think, for the X-Files. And there are some really good ideas like the ones you bring up. Kind of going back to what Darren Mooney's been talking about, especially going back to Redux, He's touched on how Carter may have been responding to criticism in the outside community about paranormal beliefs and coming from a intense secular issue about how the Files is spreading a bad message. And I can see this too as being a response. In a way, there are a few small things that don't land perfectly, but I do have to applaud. The one takeaway from the episode, I guess I'm trying to summarize that I really like, is how it tries and ride that center skepticism line really healthily. Like it problematizes militant fanaticism on either end of the spectrum of authoritarianism or like cult-like violent militias. A lesser show and many other shows would pick a side. And the fact that the X-Files is in that center space is one of the reasons I love the show. It isn't entirely successful in the way I would like it to do in problematizing it. It's a little cartoonish towards the end in how it characterizes the didactic deconstruction of the theme. But that's my overall rambling takeaway.
I think we've got a lot to dig into today, I'm sure.
Then let's get started. cold open. They're in Washington, D.C. Mulder is jogging. I thought this was a pretty fun attempt at scouting, of finding the Capitol building, however they CG'd it in, I guess, in the background. They found some cherry blossoms in Vancouver, but it is incredibly damp, and it's almost comic to the point that one of the FBI agents is on the bench reading a newspaper, and you can see the ink smearing, and it's sort of sagging in the rain.
That's a good spot. I hadn't caught that before, that the newsprint was fading in the rain, but it is a wonderfully evocative. It looks very much like a rainy, kind of early spring day, maybe in the Mid-Atlantic U.S. So they've succeeded in preserving the illusion a little bit better here than maybe they did when Vancouver was standing in for, let's say, Puerto Rico.
It's a tough job, but I got to applaud them. And
Yes.
to be fair, I couldn't tell if the newsprint was actually, that was more of a extrapolation, but you can see dark splotches of water, like as if the raindrops are falling from the tree above onto the newspaper. It looks very uncomfortable, and I enjoyed that. Basically, this is a big setup where they're following somebody. There's a handoff on a bench. We get a CG rapid disease spreading scene that is, it's interesting. And then, Mulder may or may not have helped the wanted individual escape. What are your thoughts of this cold open? There's a lot in here. There's a lot.
Yeah. I think that this is maybe kind of a rare entry in that I think sometimes when you have these kind of in media res cold opens, they don't work all that well. But I think this one kind of does. We get the appropriate sort of setup when we return from the break and we get that briefing room scene. But having this sort of elevated action, you don't actually really need to know the background for it to feel the stakes. And I think that's part of what makes this use of that technique a little bit more effective. Coming to the end of it and, seeing basically what Scully's perspective on it is, that something's going wrong here. Mulder wouldn't have lost this guy. And he's utterly unconvincing when she asks him what happened, and he says, "Oh, I lost him. He got away." Like, he's not even trying to be a good liar. So it does kind of put you in this position of confusion and uncertainty, but the suspense is maintained because you know exactly what it is you're confused and uncertain about. You don't need the kind of set dressing yet of here's what this operation was. You'll get that when you need it. But I think that's a surprisingly good use of pulling us into the action once it's already arisen.
Definitely. If I were the director, I might have asked Mulder to downplay the guilty act a little bit. But I did really enjoy Skinner in the cold open, some of Mitch Pileggi's acting, cueing that he's in on it very subtly. Contrary to some of the performances later on, he did a fabulous job. There's a lot to go on. What would you like to hit next?
Well, maybe let's talk a little bit about the present the operation that they're on and this undercover mission that Mulder has gotten himself into. We have this briefing room scene following up on this sort of restatement of the Scully is suspicious about what's happening sort of moment that we get in the basement office, where we get a little bit more background about these militia members and a bit of also post kind of Cold War paranoia about the Russian bioweapons program. We hear some of these questions and suspicions about where could this weapon have come from. One thing that I think is kind of interesting to layer in retrospect here, just from a outside the world of the show perspective, the vector lab that they mention about how security is really lax. You could have gotten this from the Russians without too much difficulty. The CIA seems pretty eager to make them the bad guy, and of course we'll see the lie put to that later on. It's my understanding, and I'm not an expert in this, but that in the 1990s the Russian state virology research center was actually a pretty state-of-the-art facility and pretty well secured. I think throughout that time, it was still alleged that there might be bioweapons research going on there, but it's not my understanding that it was like the kind of place that somebody could just roll up to and steal a bunch of smallpox from. So I think that the kind of cloud of, the kind of post Cold War, like paranoia might have been coasting a bit on the fact that they were kind of an easy bad guy for so much of the 20th century. More recently, I think things have taken a bit of a step backwards in their in the Russian like biotechnology and virology research facilities. There was a gas explosion there this past fall, and the Russian government was characteristically cagey about any risks that the public might experience based on that. But at the time this episode was made, it actually, I think the U.S. had recently poured quite a lot of money into, ensuring the security of that facility after the end of the Cold War. So it's maybe a very, very, very subtle bit of foreshadowing that, somebody is eager to make Russia out to be the bad guys here. We're gonna learn that the threat is a lot more homegrown.
Yeah, the relevance is definitely stunning. That's a great point. Yeah, I'm not familiar at all with the stuff you mentioned about the security of the biolabs in the 90s, but would say even beyond the Russophobia, that post-Cold War paranoia, there's also that aesthetic that has continued of the U.S. as the victor and capitalism versus the Soviet Union and the transition to corruption. And there's a lot of the other stereotypes that some of my Russian friends may say there's some truth to, and there's truth to in any country. But there is definitely the caricature of rust and decay and lawlessness and those things.
Yeah. And if you were a CIA operative who knew something about a revived U.S. bioweapons program, it might serve your interests to propagate some of those narratives. But we don't really get those signals until a bit later on in the episode.
Yeah, and because who else are they going to point at? That I mean, maybe the Chinese government, but other than that, at the time,
right? But in the 90s, yeah, I mean, you're dealing with this kind of end of history, Fukuyama, like, oh, that's it, we fixed it. We solved it. We had all the wars we need to solve. Mm-hmm. We had all the wars we need to have. Everything's fine now. So the search for a villain actually becomes kind of a challenge, and so you end up having to, when it's clear there's a bad guy of some kind, you kind of have to think, oh, okay, who can we trot out this time?
Oh, the 90s were a strange time. They really were. It's one of those fun things that, going back to Darren Mooney again, that he always brings up is the halcyon days, and like you're hinting at the time, 90s, everything felt so peaceful and economic prosperity. Growing up in the 90s, I don't remember it feeling that way, but it could have been just the economic world I lived in. But maybe in the tech world there was that rapid boom, but outside of that, we still had the Iraq War, we had Sarajevo, there was wars going on all the time, had all the militia stuff, Waco, Ruby Ridge. It was constant, and so and then of course it just all seemed culturally leading up to. There's a lot of talk of terror and Mideast conflict leading up to September 11th. So there's I don't know if we got the break we allegedly got.
Yeah, I think especially since I think you're probably about my age. We had so little reference point too. I mean, I could hear my mother talk about doing duck and cover drills when she was in elementary school, but I certainly didn't have any frame of reference for that growing up. And, I think to every generation's experience of its culture and of security and stability is so without reference to previous generations because we only ever experience our own. But I agree. I think there is this kind of all throughout this, maybe dominant cultural narrative of, we fought the good war and we had some rough times there in the middle of the century, but now we've weathered the storms and it's going to be smooth sailing. I agree. There's a real sense of uncertainty and instability underpinning that. And I think the militia movements are a fantastic example where, you have throughout the, I think it was the late 1980s, the farm crisis was leaving rural agricultural communities in the U.S. in absolute shambles. And you've got the end of U.S. manufacturing kind of bubbling away, and there's this catastrophe unfolding in rural communities all over the U.S. So it's no surprise that in response to that, you might see some more of these kind of sovereign citizen movements and folks kind of looking for self-sufficiency, sometimes to the point of violent insurrection, as we see in this episode, and obviously with incidents like Waco and Ruby Ridge. That was very, very prominent in I'm sure you're in my imaginations and the imaginations of folks who were watching this at the time.
You bring up a lot of great points, and the economic issues, also the fact that these violent antagonist groups, they've been around in various forms for hundreds of years, and at this point they were very much highlighted and exploited by the media to create fear. X-Files, that's a real interesting question that, again, Darren brought up. Is it problematic to create things that are encouraging dissent, whether it's a legislative authority or the police or something like this, versus, I think, the need to problematize? And that was something I saw when it came to the militia movement, that just looking at Waco and how complicated that situation was, or Ruby Ridge, for example, and just to chalk it up as this simple, here's a bunch of rednecks, or it's a cult and everybody deserved to die, or they were the violence, or the state was inherently evil, it's not going to get us anywhere. And that's where I kind of liked this episode, trying to go the middle line, not in the sense of, well, we need to sympathize with white supremacists or anything. And it seems like that's kind of where we're at now culturally, where it's hard to, in some main media spheres, to look back and understand why some of these things were motivated.
Yeah.
Go back to intense things like John Brown and the abolitionists or the Black Panthers, sure, and how the media treats that, how race, how class, all that plays a role. And for its credit, for a 90s show, it's really impressive how many of these things, even if it doesn't always analyze it, the X-Files at least touched on.
Yeah, I think that thematically it's also fitting when you compare it to the ways that small towns in general seem to appear in this series, which is, I think Chris Carter has a real, kind of love-hate relationship or love-fear relationship maybe with the ideas of small towns, because they are depicted as these places where there's something special and kind of almost magical that's being threatened and flattened by the incursions of, more cosmopolitan or, you sometimes sort of edges into these kind of pretty uncomfortable, like, globalism tropes. Mm-hmm. Although given that so often the kind of bad actors who are depicted are like, Nazi and Japanese scientists after World War II. So I think it kind of skirts the kind of anti-Semitic flavor that sort of anti-globalist narrative sometimes ends up tripping into in a lot of pop culture. But clearly small towns are also depicted in the program as sites where really terrifying evils can fester, and where the sort of strangeness and weirdness can tip over from being what makes places individual and what makes them special to what makes them really dangerous and horrifying. If you think about, like, home is the example everybody goes to, but I was just thinking recently about Roadrunners. There's something about the isolation of small communities that allows those kinds of really frightening horrors to fester. And at the same time, there are things about small communities or isolated communities that are really vulnerable to the kinds of incursions of the plans of these, wide-scale kind of conspirators. So I think given that there is this, like, dichotomous way that the show treats small communities or isolated communities, it makes sense that even if, clearly like these militia folks are very bad guys in the context of this episode, they're aligned at the beginning. It's their alignment with Mulder at the beginning, and the opportunity for him to create this like undercover operation exists because Mulder is on this mission that the audience, at least ostensibly, is meant to think of as noble and brave to be pursuing, what are these big bads that the government is into. So I think you're right that I think the term problematize is a good one for what it does both to those militias and what it does to the kinds of probing that Mulder is doing, because it asks you to both sympathize and criticize those things simultaneously.
Wonderful points. Same thing with the small towns or urban environments, for that matter, is if we don't, and we're doomed.
Sure.
And I think our current, not to get too political, but a lot of our current cultural concerns are a lack of that. A lack of people finding healthy, constructive ways of problematizing and criticizing their own communities, especially, and others. And that also includes extending sympathy and understanding for how someone reside in a certain situation or reside in an ideology. And yeah, it's a good example of intersecting ideologies on a large scale are almost inherently going to result in severe ethical ideological differences in smaller areas. But they're severe. But that doesn't legitimize throwing out the inherent root challenge that's trying to be undertaken. I'm trying to say this in safe ways that don't...
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I'm following what you're saying. I think that it's sort of a, there's a real tension between to understand root causes and address root causes versus kind of to participate in apologism and excuse making. Yep. I think there is clearly a dividing line between those things. I also think that they occupy ends of a spectrum. So you can kind of lapse into one man's trash is another man's treasure circumstances pretty easily in those contexts. But I think the expectation that we never try to play a narrative because doing so constitutes apologism, I think that's a mistake. But that said, I think there is plenty of room to describe in the context of criticism. And I think that this episode walks that line pretty thoughtfully, in that, we see this initial alignment between this like nominal alignment between the interests of our protagonist and the interests of this like extremely dangerous group. But we're also led eventually to the recognition that, this group is extremely dangerous, but if you are pausing at the expectation that they're going to be the big bad, you're missing another big bad. I think it's an invitation to complexity, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. And even the idea that you brought back before, that we have the Nazi or the Japanese scientists painted as the bad guys, and they are, but it's also more of the complicit bureaucrats that are the even more severe bad guys, the syndicate, or here the middle management CIA people doing these things. And you raised a point here of trying to formulate in a way that won't be too antagonistic, but it's something I saw a lot in the early 2000s, and I think it's still present there now, that sometimes the public or individuals outside of fiction and outside of an ideological identity divide like a political party find it incapable of comprehending corruption or sociopathy at a certain level. And what I mean by that, in the sense that, especially here in the United States, where we have a cult of, we can have low-level corruption, but the idea that there would be somebody... So take somebody that's like cartoonishly portrayed like El Chapo, and think of somebody like him could never get into political power. And we don't, or somebody who's running, like the person running the militia, could never get to be in charge of the CIA. And looking at sometimes the actions of state agencies, whether it's for corporate levels or military stuff. A lot of the things that X-Files touches on, we can go back to the treatment of the indigenous people. You have to be a sociopath. I mean, yes, of course, there's cultural racism and all of those things. And that is one issue, I guess, with the X-Files is sometimes is if you're touching on real things and if you portray villains too cartoonishly, I'm just worried it can be a slight disservice. And that kind of gets to the jumping towards the end, which we don't have to get to, but it's that thing where I think it would be a healthy place to step back and to go, yes, this military, or we could even say it like Waco is, as an example, it's a problematic situation. You have a cult leader, you have all of these things that are there, but then you also have a government agency that is engaged in entrapment and ended up resulting in the deaths of however many kids being killed and then still painted everybody as monsters. We have a government that puts sanctions on Iraq and leads to the death of potentially 100,000 children, and they're okay with it. So it's this issue of scale that's harder to comprehend, and that's what I like. I guess the X-Files tries to connect the personal, the local corruption, the local sociopathy, with the micro and the macro. If any of that makes any sense, you were about to say something. I'm turning it over.
No, I think so. I mean, I was going to make a glib comment about how, if I remember correctly, at Ruby Ridge, the family dog got shot. Like the marshals who were there pursuing the Weaver family, I think they shot his dogs. But that's a really like flip kind of criticism to make. Like, yeah, they were concerned that their operation was going to be blown because a dog was barking at them. But also it is just like, it's kind of a cartoonish almost representation of how you have to look at your choices when something like that's happening. Like, ooh, am I still the good guy here? And I think that, that's an example, and Waco's another example of situations where it's very hard to find good guys. And the good guy, bad guy dichotomy really breaks down. But yeah, I think this episode, I agree with you, kind of lapses a little bit, at least if I understand you correctly, then I agree with it. Lapses a bit into being a little overly maybe pedantic or kind of a just so story at the end, particularly that scene with the CIA agent Lemus, I think is his name, at the end of the episode, where he's saying, well, what do you hope to accomplish? Say that were true, that I'm really very corrupt. You don't say that unless you're a super bad guy. So I think that that doesn't work as effectively for me in this episode as it does in, say, F. Emasculata, where you have the cigarette smoking man explaining to Mulder, hey, here's why you can't just tell everybody the truth about this, because the truth about a bioweapon that's been released into the general population, you've got these inmates running around who are infected with it, you're going to have mass panic and people will die. And Mulder's furious about that, and so he goes to Scully and she says, we can't tell the public about this, we're going to have mass panic, people will die. Like, yeah, that's a very reasonable rejoinder, and it makes a lot of sense to put that truth in the mouth of a bad guy in F. Emasculata. Whereas what we're doing here is we're having the bad guy, say this, give this kind of lofty description of, well, do you want to bring down the federal government? Obviously not. Like, that's not that, that's why Mulder was undercover in a militia, not actually joining it. But I think that that's one of the sort of flaws of the episode for me, where, some of those complications, I think, end up getting washed over a little bit toward the end of the episode, and it becomes I think it endeavors to kind of give it a kind of clean black and white ending, when the story it's telling is fundamentally not particularly black and white.
Yeah, and it's not helpful. Mm-hmm. So, and I think your allusion to F. Emasculata is excellent. That's a perfect example of how it could have been done. And even leading up to the conclusion, the CIA agent is very cartoonish in his anger. He just looks out of control and crazy, and giving up the ghost, like I'm a bad guy.
Yeah.
And is that really how things are going to work? I watched a documentary, I think it was probably 10, 15 years ago, I don't even remember, about Ruby Ridge the BBC made, and I was like, what? What I remember happening was not that. And then, because his kid was killed shot in the back, I believe,
Yeah.
and then his wife was killed. And I remember they had a clip in the documentary from Bill Maher making a joke. It was too bad they killed the dog.
Yeah.
And everybody laughing. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, like he was so glib about the fact, like people lost their lives here, and you had this one guy hold up that you were actually interested in. You killed his entire family. Like, was that really necessary? It's amazing that the invocation of Ruby Ridge becomes this, like, sort of shibboleth that means different things in different communities, but fundamentally, like, the actual humanity of what happened on that day is really kind of gets papered over.
That's the great way of putting it as a shibboleth. It's crucial, and I think what's getting at here with the X-Files and touching on these things, and that's why I wish it could be a little more careful, dig a little bit deeper. If we don't dig into them, if we don't deconstruct the situation and de-escalate the identity that's associated with the perspective, so we can just look at the situation and humanize it, we're in big trouble. As you were talking about the small town thing, and I think it plays a lot into that, and that idea of, like in the Bill Maher joke, the small town can be easily lumped into state. Oh, you're ignorant.
Yeah.
You're a racist. If you're a kid of a racist, you're a racist. You deserve this X situation. And that's not, and the problem is now that's the shibboleth that the outside group is hearing, and the inside group is hearing, you think we should die, you're an oppressor, you're not giving me a hand, you're going to create and exacerbate the racism even further. And so to have a show that, like X-Files, that could put something out in a safe fantasy space, problematize it for people from all perspectives, and give a space for people to deal with it, and then pull it out. I think that's a wonderful thing, but it also requires a lot of responsibility and a deft hand that it doesn't always have. But I'm glad it was trying.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that for all that there are aspects of this that I think a couple other episodes do better. I think F. Masculata does, the putting the truth in the mouth of a bad guy better than this does putting like an obvious kind of reductio ad absurdum in the mouth of a bad guy. I do think that creating some parallels or alignments that maybe we aren't accustomed to seeing is a sort of helpful way to try to unpack a little bit of that stuff. So, maybe a bit more, biting off a bit more than it could chew, but by and large, I still think the episode is generally pretty successful at that, even if I think the ending falls a little flat.
Totally agree. Yeah. Considering the pace of the episode and how much happens in the 44 minutes or whatever. You mentioned earlier about when we need to know that the case is on. It's been a while since I had watched the episode until I watched it again for this Xcast, and was so pleasantly surprised how quickly they cut to the chase. Like 12 minutes in, okay, Scully's on board. Let's get on with the show. Yeah,
I think they could really easily have over-dramatized and kind of hammed up and made the whole episode been about, ooh, Mulder's acting shady, like Scully is suspicious about it. For me, the replay or the kind of reintroduction of those emotional beats from, say, like Wet Wired, the scene where here in Pine Bluff Variant, when Scully shows up at the hotel and she's kind of sort of spying on Mulder a little bit to try to figure out what the hell is going on here. You know, it's kind of reminiscent of that parking lot scene in Wet Wired when she goes out and she thinks she's like hallucinating and she thinks she sees him lighting up with the cigarette smoking man in his car. Just from the perspective of the ambience and the kind of emotional feel of the scene, it's kind of similar to that, even though we know that in Wet Wired something is wrong with Scully, and we know here there's something we don't know about what's going on, but everything she's seeing is a real thing that she's seeing. But I like those parallels here, and I appreciate that, similar to Wet Wired, where they could have played up that portion of the episode and made Scully's off her rocker and that's going to be super dangerous, and now she's on the run and we have to find her and maybe she'll die. That really only takes up a pretty brief period of the second act of the of the episode. And in this one, again, like that sort of rupture between our two leads only takes up an admirably short period of time in this one. I think that element of the pacing is quite strong.
Speaking of Scully's response to the situation, overall I thought it was handled really well, but I thought one plot point, which I'll get to, weakened the episode for me. It doesn't ruin it, but I think they could have got out of it a little bit easier. So the first thing I do like, in general, Scully's behavior and the skepticism, even though Duchovny's playing a little cartoonishly. For example, when she's tailing, she's playing it really smart. Her lights are off. But then when she goes to confront Mulder in her apartment, they have the conversation when they both should know you don't have that conversation there. And I know they did it so that they could get eavesdropped.
Right.
But I thought if they would have just had the conversation in the FBI headquarters, then you could have the CIA agent get the recording, slip it to the person, and that will help connect suspecting who's guilty. It's a mole inside the FBI, and our main characters won't have to be so careless to have it happen. But it's a minor point. Just script doctrine.
Yeah, I think I think it happens as much for kind of balance and setting reasons as it does for plot reasons. Like, we don't really get another, like, kind of intimate conversation between the two of them about what's happening at all in the episode. I think the only other interactions we have between them are the ones where Mulder's acting super shady at the very beginning of the episode, and then when they're kind of reunited at the end of the episode, like when they both confront Lemus. But I think that this is the only other scene that the two of them have together, if I remember correctly. So I think that part of it is saying, okay, here's a set of things that have to happen in an X-Files episode. One of them is that we need, like, to put these two people together and just have them, like, experience this, like, the reality that they're sitting in together, and sort of put the pieces together of the puzzle that they're trying to solve. I agree with you that it doesn't necessarily have to happen in Mulder's apartment. Like, that's probably not the smartest thing. But yeah, I do think that having them step outside of, a context like the basement office where maybe they're accustomed to being listened in on a bit more. Although actually at this point, both of their apartments have been bugged how many times, so maybe that's not a good reason.
And what just happened in Redux? Come on.
Yeah, sure. But I think that setting it in one of their homes does give the scene a little bit of, like, an intimacy that the episode is otherwise very much lacking, because it's so it's so go from the perspective of the operation. And this is one of the few scenes that at least initially appears to be happening outside the context of the operation. Everything else is either actually in it or in transit to or from it. So I don't know. I think it might be about mood setting a little bit more than plot, by having it happen in his home. But yeah, it is a little bit of a misstep. But if these two people were actually as vigilant about not being listened to as they would need to be to preserve their safety all the time, though, we wouldn't have a show, because they would just have to do everything in writing. Like, all of their interactions with each other as people would just be like little notes written on Post-its that they'd hand back and forth.
All fair points. I guess part of it for me was just with the goal of making the acting of the head CIA guy less cartoonish.
Yeah.
And so you could cue to the audience, something's up, without having him mug at the camera.
Right. Yeah, he wouldn't have to do quite as much scenery chewing in order for us to get that he's our bad guy.
Oh, but those are good points.
No, I was just going to step backwards for a quick second to the scene before that, the torture scene.
Oh, I just had on my notes. Yes, let's go.
Because holy crap. Like, I don't know how many times I've seen this episode, probably 8 or 10 times, and I still can't, like, I have to hold the earphones out of my ears for the pinky breaking. I just can't with it. It's so, he's not going to die. And similar with the like the kind of execution walk at the end of the episode, he's not going to die, but it's still tremendously frightening. Even having seen it a bunch of times. So I don't exactly know how Bowman manages to pull off the level of kind of sinister dread that both of these scenes include, but good Lord.
A couple other things the episode does, and this scene in particular I think does really well, is, and this may be partly Duchovny, partly Bowman, but putting humor in at just the right moments. Like is this the Pepsi challenge?
Yeah.
It could undercut a lot, but it does it just so then, oh God, then the dread drops as soon as...
Yeah.
The other thing is the guy, the skinhead.
My God, that guy's so scary.
He's so good. Good in the sense of portraying, he just feels evil.
Yeah.
He's very creepy and carries that scene. He just works.
I think that the couple of points where he has anything to say, like clearly he takes some relish in what he's doing. Like the end of the episode right before the execution walk, where they talk about him being an accessory to a federal crime, and he says, "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Like clearly he had his enjoyment and relish of the like sadism of his job outweighs like whatever tangible other concerns he might have about his own kind of security or well-being or whatever, and in just the right way. And like for sure, you know, having he looks like a guy that would be the guy who roughs people up for a militia, and maybe that's sort of a prejudiced thing to say, but he like sure carries it. Yeah, good Lord, it just really does bring a real air of dread to both of those scenes.
So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about problematizing things and having a little bit of nuance. And I like the fact that they created a militia situation for Mulder to be in where he can openly criticize the skinhead as being an idiot white supremacist without getting rebuked, yet he's still a member of the group. And to kind of let that sit there is really nice. And the fact that you have a guy who's very imposing, but he's clearly coded as like a lapdog and a moron, but not cartoonishly.
Yeah.
You see this guy who is a fanatic, but he's also not even cartoonish. And so there's all of this.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm giving it way too much credit, but there's a lot of subtlety to that character, and that makes it even more terrifying and feels more real than I think a lot of other actors or shows would have directed somebody like that.
Yeah. I think Duchovny's performance creates an important aspect of it too, because like, especially after he gets his finger broken, he shrinks away from this guy. Like, Mulder is clearly terrified of him and like, you know, has a lot of scorn and contempt and hatred for him too, but obviously is just like very physically intimidated by him. We don't see Mulder physically intimidated by people very often at all in this show. And so really like seeing him extremely vulnerable to somebody this violent and this dangerous who takes pleasure in being violent and dangerous is like the novelty of that, I think itself is part of what makes it frightening.
It's a fantastic point. Also then it allows Bowman and the script to not overplay it. Mm-hmm. Look at, here's the, you know, I'm the goon in a lot of like a Schwarzenegger film or something.
Yeah.
Instead, let's let Duchovny do the work, like you're saying, and it worked. It is an incredibly effective scene. Incredibly, considering the context, the pace, and how little setup time they actually had. A real achievement. Related to that, we also haven't talked about the best part of the episode, the disease.
I was hoping you would go to the movie theater when you said the best part of the episode, and I don't think I'm wrong in saying like that is one of the most haunting images I can put my finger on, maybe in the course of the series, at least in the course of, you know, this season, walking into that theater and seeing all these just like specters covered over with the plastic. Oh my God, what a horrifying image that is.
And the guy, the one bad militia guy, when he starts asking for popcorn, for some reason I really like his acting there.
I wanted to actually touch on that briefly because so we figure out that the money is on the ticket stub. So he's just trying to get her to turn her back so that he can get access to the ticket stub, like the spool, long enough to spray it down. But it's like he's not worried about making this kind of oddball, overly demanding request of her, because it's not like he has to worry about being remembered. Literally everybody here is going to die. And so it's frightening to see that kind of lack of concern about a witness. You need to be subtle enough to get somebody to like let you do the thing, but you don't actually have to be that subtle. Oh God. Like, yeah, it's chilling.
That's good sociopathy right there. And that's what I want the X-Files to capture. More media. It's great. This is pointless, but when you watch something for the X-Cast, you see things you don't normally maybe, and I noticed that the movie posters switch places in Morning and Night.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, so Die Hard with a Vengeance is on the left side and Titanic's on the right. And then in the evening scene, they switch, I think. It could be the vice versa, but yeah. So it's just fun to know that those probably weren't the films showing.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's pointless. When
this was filmed versus when it aired, I don't actually know if those two films were in theaters at the same time. I didn't think to look it up ahead of It would have been pretty cool if I'd just been able to, subtly drop it in, as if I could tell you, oh yes, those would have been showing during the same week in whatever 1997 or so, but I'm not that cool.
Or you are that cool that you're not wasting your time with information like that and instead memorizing facts about the X-Files.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely cooler.
Okay, and back at the hotel, just in case there's folks listening that want us to bring it up, we probably should. The Scully quip with the hotel clerk. Are you the wife? Not even close.
There's like a tiny Michelle Milbauer dancing on my shoulder who like really wanted us to bring that up, I think. I think the shipper contingent of the X-Files audience probably appreciated having yet another example where Mulder and Scully get mistaken for a couple. But I definitely think it's like the least interesting thing about that set of scenes.
My thought was Carter. It's Carter doing a dig at the shippers.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly plausible, but it's amazing to me how many kind of inept hotel clerks these two run into. Like, This guy just totally plays into Scully's "I'm frustrated about something and you're going to fix it for me." It doesn't even register to him that, oh, maybe I shouldn't be disclosing information about who my guests are. Like it brings up that other the clerk and I can't remember if it's in one of the season 1 or season 2 mythology episodes. I can't remember if it's Colony, or I think it's Colony, where Mulder leaves a message at a hotel for Scully, and in the time it takes the guy to find a pencil to write it down, like he's forgotten who it's for. Come on. Yeah. They're just so hapless. Like we need some hotel clerks who are as competent as the train conductor in 731.
The Davy train?
Yeah.
Well, that could be a good buddy comedy. We could team up Davy with some inept hotel clerk to provide the comic mischief.
Yeah, and also like make sure that hotel residents like get their keys and know which rooms they're staying in, and that other people don't know what rooms they're staying in, and things like that.
What a world! One
other moment that happens as the scene is unfolding that I really like is the scene where Mulder is meeting with Skinner and Agent Lemus to kind of touch base with them before the kind of bank robbery plays out. It's so risky for him to be having this conversation with them, and I think I think the episode does a good job kind of hammering that home and making it feel like, oh God, given where we are in this operation, it's so dangerous for you to even be sitting here with these people. I think in a program where you're watching your protagonist go do something and you know that he's going to be back next week, it's hard to ramp up that level of suspense and anticipation. But even that kind of relatively simple exposition scene, I think ends up being pretty robust because you're aware of that. Also because it's another case where Lemus kind of tips his hand a little bit. Mulder and Skinner are talking about wanting fund transfer schedules to be able to provide to the group. And Lemus is like, oh, I've got them ready because I anticipated this. And it just doesn't quite land right. You get the sense like this is it's a little bit suspicious that you would know that this is the thing they were going to do next. It's like, oddly specific. So it's another good cue that he's a bad guy. But I was very impressed with that scene. I think for something that doesn't need to accomplish too much plot-wise, it actually does a really good job ratcheting up tension, even though it's not like there's a gimp in the corner who's threatening to break Mulder's finger again, but it still feels very dangerous.
Yeah, even though being in the safe, it's not like they have to show anybody following or watching or even watching him, or show Mulder entering Quantico and have check around his back or anything like that. He's just simply in a room, and it's a big enough room in the way it's shot. No, you're right on the money. One of the quotes I wanted to bring up, a small conversation, which kind of gets back to our earlier discussion, which I think does a pretty good job of underplaying it, which is, so I think it was Haley who asked Mulder, "Are you a believer?" And he says, "I have my beliefs."
Yeah.
"Are you willing to die for them?" "I'd rather it didn't come to that."
That's a great exchange.
It is great. And it's not only funny, but I think it also plays in so quickly and easily distinguishes Mulder from these people. Somebody who's got as delusional as Mulder may be, and you want to challenge his character choices, that's the difference between his fanaticism and that. And they just do it simply and with a little bit of humor. That's some good writing, I think, to do it that quickly and out of the punchline, and then transition to, "I have a job for you, and you're Dracula."
Yeah, that's a great little exchange, and I think that for a show that is often extremely earnest about what Mulder does or doesn't believe, and about the role of belief and the role of truth in his life, it's kind of nice that in a context where that is being challenged, and it's being challenged in the context of something as dangerous and as unaligned with his principles as the mission of this organization that he's infiltrating. It feels appropriate for that to be a moment where you get that little injection of the kind of lack of sincerity of Mulder's sense of humor. So I thought that was very thoughtful. One thing, just to come back for a second to kind of truth and sincerity and belief, that I am a little mystified by is when Mulder does show back up with the fund transfer schedules for the militia group, and he gives Haley the list of them, he unspools the film and holds it up to a lamp and looks at it and says lies within lies.
Yeah.
And I'm so uncertain about what that's meant to telegraph to us. It seems clear that Haley doesn't know, or at least is very surprised by the manner in which his organization is vulnerable, because Bremer succeeds in sending him on his merry way to go get killed by the toxin at the end. So I guess I'm not really sure what to make of that line. It would make sense if he were saying it to himself, if he knew that he was being played. But I don't really think he does at this point in the episode. What do you think about that?
Exactly. It doesn't make sense, because I don't mean to be making assumptions about people's lack of supernatural vision qualities, but I cannot read microfilm nor microfiche over a lamp without a special device assisting it. So it's not like I could see that and go, "Oh, Bremer's name's, it's his alias." Even if you could read it, even if you had supervision, could you see it that quickly? All he simply did is Mulder handed him film, and that's it.
And he made sure there was something on it. Yeah, my impression of him holding it up to the lamp was making sure that it wasn't just an empty spool of film.
Yeah, but it wasn't. So then what's the lie? Right.
Well, yeah, exactly. I don't really understand what's happening there, and you wouldn't be able to tell if there was, fictitious information in it or something. And if you could tell, you wouldn't, build a bank heist based on that fictitious information. So, yeah, I guess, and there's not really other stuff happening in the context of that scene that it seems like he could be referring to, because they're just having this kind of mundane conversation about, he asks for the files, Mulder gives them to him, he says he needs them back by tomorrow, and then he tells Mulder to put the hood on, or the gimp will put it on for you. That's all that happens in that scene. So I don't know what Haley is talking about, but maybe he's just maybe this is just meant to be a signal to us about his degree of kind of danger and paranoia and like the kind of precarity of the situation because of that, to kind of ramp up the tension. But I think that line would work a lot better if we knew what it meant.
I just have to assume that something got cut from the script. We missed something.
Yeah,
I don't know what it would be.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if you think of like what they could have put in between, because he doesn't know yet until he gets that about Bremer. And he still, like you said, he still trusts Mulder enough to go on this thing.
Yeah.
The heist, it doesn't make sense, but the direction is so good that you just kind of roll with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, doesn't really affect my enjoyment of the episode that much, but it has always kind of left me scratching my head. Speaking of the heist,
Let's head there.
yeah, that I think is a hard thing to pull off when it's not the point of the episode, but like I feel like it works pretty well. The real like conflict and fear when Mulder is expected to put down the teller. He's got a frickin' mask on, but he's still like successfully emoting, which is pretty impressive. And you really get a sense of this, like, I'm gonna die if I can't maintain my cover, and I desperately don't want to like murder this poor man like in cold blood. But yeah, I think given that the episode really, this is certainly one of the dramatic high points of it. But for me, it's not even the most memorable, even though like it's a pretty dramatic bank robbery. Yeah, I don't know. I'm fond of this scene, even though there are others that I think carry a bit more weight.
There's a lot of good action set pieces in this episode, going back to what you started off talking about. And this bank heist is really impressive, considering how low its importance is. And I'm going to go on a limb here and be honest, I'm not a huge fan of how the Mulder, is he going to shoot the bank teller scene plays out. I think it goes on too long, and the resolution is a little goofy. Where he's just waiting there, and they keep telling him to do it, and Mulder doesn't think of anything. He just sits there. Mm-hmm. I'm watching it 3 minutes in, just shoot off to the side, and then walk out and say he's dead.
Yeah, I think it would have been a lot more. I like that Bremer is the one to get him out of this situation, because we don't know at this point that why he's doing it, but it's a useful little thing to have, like, to be able to look back on at the end of the episode. But I agree with you that it lasts too long, and it's weird that it goes over a commercial break.
Yeah.
Or like an act break. That was a sort of strange choice. I do think that realistically, like, if this is a test of a guy, in your crew that you're trying to make sure that he's loyal to you, like, having him stand around for 90 seconds deciding whether to do the thing or not probably gives you all the information you need. So at that point, I don't really feel like he's maintaining his cover all that well. But yeah, if it had been a matter of like, 8 or 10 seconds where Haley is really pushing him, and that's what's happening, like that's the emotional beat you're just stuck in, and then Bremer gets him out of it, then I think it's a sharper kind of punctuation point than having it kind of interspersed with watching what the rest of the terrorists are doing.
I think it could have, like you said, with Bremer, it could have cued nicely, and that Bremer could have seen it, and you could just see the head turn, and then look back over at Haley, then go over to Mulder and say, traceable, and do that. Even though I'm not sure, that's kind of a weak excuse, but that's okay if it went quicker.
It is kind of a weak excuse. Then why did you bring that one on the bank heist?
Exactly.
That was a bad gun. Pack a different gun. What are you doing? Anyway, some real logistical problem. Again, maybe this militia, much like the motel, needs somebody with a little bit more, like kind of logistical expertise to kind of get their ducks in a row, if that's a commonplace problem they have.
Yeah, well, considering the real world, it's perhaps more accurate this way.
Perhaps.
After the heist, we've got we talked about a little bit, the execution scene, and Bremer, of course, lets Haley go, sort of. What do you want to talk about there?
Well, I will just say that that directing this like kind of closeout of the operation toward making clear, okay, Mulder and Scully were recorded, they're busted. Like, if this is an undercover operation, it's absolutely screwed right now. How on earth is our fair hero going to get out of this alive? The sense of the walls closing in on that, and then that like incredibly depressing kind of sort of slaughterhouse execution walk at the end is really dark, as we talked about. But I like how the scene kind of slows down, just ever so briefly when the gunshot goes off.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's a nice sense of kind of time dilating and like your life flashing before your eyes that happens there to kind of bring you into the experience of that Mulder's having. And I also like that the camera stays on his face while you're hearing that, so that it's not like you get to watch this surprise switcheroo. You get kind of taken aback by it as much as Mulder does, because you hear it and you don't know what's happened yet. Like, you kind of want to think the cavalry has shown up and like shot the bad guy, but it's much smaller and more intimate and stranger than that, and kind of leads to, I guess, to paraphrase, Haley again, kind of wheels within wheels, or questions within questions or something.
Yeah, and it actually works out well, I think, for the arc of the skinhead and the fact that it's him getting his just desserts, but they don't play it up. This guy is disposable. He's just as disposable, low intelligence, goon, thug, whatever, and they don't overplay it like, oh, it makes sense. It fits. It doesn't, as opposed to some of the other scenes. Yeah, there's a big setup, but it kind of makes sense. I'm going to drag him out here away from everybody else. I'm going to wait a moment, and then I'm going to let him sit there because I'm going to make the skinhead think this is going to happen so I can get the surprise on him. It works. The whole scene's staged well. Yeah.
It gives a seriousness. It gives a seriousness, or like a gravitas, I think. Cool. And then we've got our confrontation at the end.
And if I'm going to jump in here like a horrible moocher, Anderson yelling the line, "You knew about this the whole time." This scene is, like you clearly noted, and I would join you on, there's major problems with some of the cartoonishness. But her delivery of that line, wow. I got chills. I was like, geez.
She sells the hell out of it. Yeah. I think in general, one of my favorite things about this show is Mulder and Scully yelling at people. I don't really ever get tired of that. Like, whether it's in Fight the Future, the information desk guy that she yells at to pick up the phone and make it happen, yes, or Luther Lee Boggs or whatever, or like Mulder yelling in hospitals, all of that. Point. I just like watching these two get angry with other people. Like, the righteous rage of it is tremendously satisfying to watch.
Which is funny because I don't normally like it when they yell at each other.
No, me either.
Like when Mulder does it, you writing those little notes, like that scene, like that, it doesn't work. But you are right. When they go after other people, it's just precious as diamonds.
It's such a nice piece of, like, it's like when you're watching one of those, another, like, it's the X-Files kind of more conventional version of an action movie set piece where you see the two heroes, like, go back to back, like, in a gunfight. It's like that, only they're doing it with their kind of, their righteous indignation. But there is something very satisfying about that.
And the good news is we do not have Mutostrip. And we are not like Haley in the car. And just contrasting to the beginning, the CG in the cold open, it's a little goofy. That's fine. I'm not going to knock it. It's a TV show. It's CG in the 90s. It's fine. But I do want to praise unbelievably good, disturbing practical effects.
Oh my God.
And I'm not somebody who enjoys gore or anything like that, but I still have to give people credit. That is unsettlingly effective.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, and it's like, I think the cartoonish criticism, I think most often when you see that leveled at the X-Files, it's about like some of the really overt practical effects more than it is about, I mean, I guess a little bit sometimes about the very earnest, use of catchphrases frequently. But I'm thinking about, Firewalker, when you have the giant, like, phallus exploding out of people's throats. That's a pretty weird, gross, and inarguably cartoonish way for that particular, like, disease to sort of manifest on screen. This is just really creepy and frightening. And I think part of what helps kind of focus on that is, first, the way you see the car just kind of like drag down off to the side of the road, the body slumping over the horn, and then the key, like honing in on the key. I think there's a great like subtlety to focusing on those elements more so than playing up the kind of body horror aspect of it, which we've already been duly horrified by. The movie theater scene did an excellent, very creepy job of that. Much better than the Folger Park scene did. But I love the kind of creepy unsettlingness of just watching this car like weave off the side of the road.
It's a good ending. Yeah. No arguments. All right, and now on to the mailbag. So a little bit of magic, a little shift of time here. Unfortunately, I forgot during the original recording to do the mailbag. So Caredwen cannot join me for this segment, unfortunately. So that's all my fault. I had worked a 13-hour day the day before, and my brain was broken, which may have came through in some of the previous discussion you listened to, but hopefully there's some joy as well in my heart. So on to the mailbag. Tons of great comments. Seems to be a really well-loved episode, deservedly. Starting off, we got good old Kurt North, manager of the Time Is Now Millennium podcast. Check it out if you have not. It is a blast. He notes, Pine Bluff Variant is one of those X-Files that I have no problem throwing on. It's a great propulsive episode, a really good conspiracy thriller, which is a genre I love. It's nice that they use events from Patient X to give us a reason why they reached out to Mulder. I forgot about that connection. Thank you. The finger-breaking scene always gets to me. Ouch. And then gives a shout-out to Sam Anderson, who would later go on to star in Lost as Bernard, in a completely different role. Sharon McKenna joins in and says, I've always loved this one, and think it's often overlooked and underappreciated. Definitely John Shaban's best solo episode. And Rob Bowman's directing lends it a really cinematic feel. I agree with that about Shaban. It's interesting that his other episodes definitely don't lend to a lot of action set pieces, but he seems to write well for this pace. I love the tension between Mulder and Scully when the trust between them is threatened. It's great to see the consequences of Mulder getting in really over his head without his partner's backup, and interesting to see how Scully deals with her suspicion and paranoia about Mulder lying to her. It's got a really different feel to it compared to your standard episode, and the X-Files feels alarmingly plausible. Definitely a highlight of the season for me. I also love the continuity with Mulder's broken finger and Folly Ado. Good point. It's great to see a little detail like that carry over from one episode to another when so often injuries sustained in one episode are completely forgotten by the next. Yes. Yeah. Cortlan Waters Bartley notes that I think this is a really great mythology-adjacent episode. We have all the elements of a conspiracy and cover-up, plus the added overlap with the virus, but we also have Mulder in an undercover role, which is rare. I really like the way this story plays out and the confrontational moment at the end when the bad guy essentially gets to walk away, even though Mulder knows the truth is particularly powerful to me. It's like a precursor of what's to come, that finding out the truth or even exposing the truth isn't the same as imposing consequences. And then Chandru Ravindran kind of connects back to some of Caredwen's comments about F. Emasculata. In my opinion, this is the finest example of the X-Files doing a thriller, along with F. Emasculata. Fantastic direction and pacing. Sure, we all know Mulder's not going to die or actually be the bad guy, but it's compelling watching it all play out. John Shaban has never been better or less offensive to different cultures. The interrogation scene elicits many unflattering sounds from me, most of which sound like whiny versions of Mulder's yelp and Jose Chung. What an intense scene and fantastic acting from Duchovny. Loved the Die Hard with a Vengeance reference, second Die Hard reference the show would do, even though it swapped the posters. That was my comment there. And Scully's tenacity is fantastic throughout. The only thing I don't like here was the heist scene. Rob Bowman really tries to generate a sense of tension and emotion when Mulder has to decide whether or not to shoot the civilian, but is undermined by the use of the mask. We end up with these endless camera shots of Mulder in an emotionless mask trying to emote with his eyes. See how similar to what Caredwen's point was. But luckily, all is forgotten when we get to the finale with Mulder nearly being executed. And we end with a great tag team of Scully and Mulder ripping into the shady agent. Basically, this episode felt like The X-Files meets 24, and it works brilliantly. An example of The X-Files at the peak of its powers. So Andrew Levitt gives it 5 stars, and here's some of his comments. A classic standalone X-Files episode that draws on recurring mythology elements, such as Scully's paranoia, a nice reversal about Mulder being drawn into the anti-government militia to strengthen it. What's more, given the context of Mulder's character arc during Season 5, his joining an extremist group is believable, tense, compelling, and scary in its believability, especially in modern times. And then again, 5 stars has some other great comments. Kylie Portnow notes it's one of her favorites. I love the feel of the episode, the look, the plot, the script. The paranoia and pace are just perfect. Yeah, the pace, the wonderful pace. Michael Little, once again, will agree that the chorus chimes, that it is Shaban's finest solo script, with great pacing and direction by Rob Bowman. One of the most cinematic episodes of the entire series. I also love the score. I would agree with that. The score is great. We didn't comment on it, but that's very true, very true. The scene in which the popcorn is sprayed with a bioweapon, or the tickets, the little switcheroo, is one of the most unnerving sequences in the whole series for me. Great classic episode. And to think that most reviews from 1998 were very critical, labeling it a bad Texas Walker Ranger knockoff. Holy moly. Okay, so we're going to dig down here. Adam Silva asks for a clarification. Michael Little then continues. Several professional reviews for the episode from 1998 are pretty negative. Fangoria said it was like an episode of Walker, Texas Ranger. Cinefantastique criticized it for not having a paranormal element. Shows how out of touch many of the critics were even back then. That is bizarre. I don't know how many episodes of Walker, Texas Ranger had skin-melting diseases. That's absolutely bizarre. Okay. We got a newcomer to the basement. Gareth Bundy also jumps in and states, this was always one of my favorite episodes. It's a strange one. Almost a little mini-movie. Thrilling and with a fantastic supporting cast. Can't argue with that, although some of the acting we commented on, but overall it's fabulous. Ashley Jeremy Royer has some good comments kind of talking about some of the stuff Caredwen and I were talking about earlier here. Sums it up nicely. I like this. A necessary grounding episode. It can't all be purity and killer trees. Pine Bluff Variant keeps the show earnest amid the high strangeness, while carrying on the show defining themes of Deep Throat's last words. It also foretells movie theaters as target of terror and violence. Seems like it was inspired by the chemical weapon attack in the Tokyo subway in 1995. Which serves to make it more unsettling than the average X-File. Wasn't a fan when I saw it as a teen because it wasn't mytharc or even paranormal, but I wholly appreciate how sound and effectively done it is now. So I think those are great points, especially the idea of the need for the show to have some sort of a tonal pause so that some of the more bombastic or extreme paranormal episodes or conspiratorial episodes play more authentically or play more naturally. It gives them more of a punch, I guess is what I would say. And it kind of goes back to the stuff we were talking about with, or it seems like Carter and here Shaban, trying to play with the rejection of the conspiratorial, paranormal area and go for the high skeptic worldview and abstracting around. So it's interesting to take that, sort of like Redux did similarly, which is a little bit more grounded, even though, yes, there's conspiracies and all the rest, but it harkens back to the 70s thriller as opposed to, something like Independence Day. Great points there. Thank you. More praise from Megan Shaw, and then also saying the first time I watched this, I was in complete suspense. Highly underrated. Yeah, these are some common themes throughout here, but it seems to be an incredibly well-loved episode. Not a single negative comment in the basement. I guess Michael Little also just throws out another note on the second call for comments about the score. So 2 people mentioned that, and I feel bad for not bringing it up, because especially with Mind's Eye, where I think the score is very intrusive here, it works really well and helps push the scenes along in this episode. So thank you for bearing with this potentially more boring mailbag with just me in the solo talking chair. But I really appreciate everybody's comments, as always. A lot of fun to read, and keep sharing as the X-Cast marches on. All right, and now back to the closing comments discussion with Caredwen. Thanks for joining me today talking. This is an absolute blast. Can you tell folks what you're up to, if you have any events or anything you want to share?
I guess folks can find me in the basement group or in the Patreon Slack or on Twitter at Caredwen, Caredwen.
Great. I think I need I am a patron, but I keep hearing about the Slack, but I'm not on the Slack. It sounds like there's fun.
Get on the
things,
Slack.
So regardless, thank you very much, and this was great. Until next time, as this episode was duly preaching, trust no one.
Previously on the We Made This Network. Fast, Furious, and a bottle of Corona.
So, Andrew, as our guest, what's the first flavour you're going to bring to the meal?
So, I think it's impossible when you're talking about the Fast and Foolishness to discuss Too Fast, Too Foolish without talking about Tyrese Gibson, right?
Yes.
He is the heart and soul of this movie. If this was a sports team, he'd be your Kawhi Leonard. He'd be your Wayne Rooney. Well, no, we don't talk about him anymore. He'd be... This franchise, if nothing else, finds its way of bringing you a diverse set of characters while putting Paul Walker in the middle, and you leave the movie not caring Paul Walker exists. Right?
Pick up a podcast.
Literally kicked the door open to their dressing room, ran in, grabbed a pack of plastic champagne flutes, screamed victory, and ran out again.
Fantastic.
And I was just stood there next to the door because I didn't know what was going on, and the drummer from the band just walked out, looked at me, and was like, What? And I was like, I don't know.
Without a mouse.
I don't think he's as good as Dennis Quaid.
No.
He's not charming.
No, Dennis Quaid has that likability.
Yeah.
You can imagine him being a dad.
He has that, oh shucks, I've got a cowboy hat, I sort of don't know what I'm doing, but I'll bumble through it sort of charm.
Yeah.
Whereas this guy's just a bit slightly aggressive, I'd say.
He did have another child, but they're currently rolled up in a carpet in his cupboard.
Yeah.
Like, this is the kind of vibe he's giving off.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This Podcast Network. The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This Podcast Network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music, and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.